Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. What a day we are having at Asheville Wordfest. I can't tell you how gratifying it is to have you all here. I believe in poetry more than I believe in anything else, and I always have. I've always believed that it would heal, I always believed it would open, I always believed that it was a saving grace in a wounding world. So to be in a room filled with people who believe in poetry as well, and who believe in thought, and who believe in feeling, and who believe in wisdom, that's what I do this for. Like, I started having it on my birthday, Shakespeare's birthday, so I could sort of hide it under that. And so I would never be alone on my birthday, but now I realize I do it so I'll never be alone. I want to thank this marvelous group of people who have been bringing cookies and apples and bananas and chocolate without my even asking for it. So let's hear it for the volunteers. I'd like to thank WPVM Radio here in our very own Asheville Wordfest studio, broadcasting live to 1,500 people who are viewing hopefully online and will be able to view by going there, WPVMFM.org. Become a member, listen to us. It's a beautiful, beautiful station run by Davine and a wonderful team of people. I'd like to thank Creative Campfires for videotaping this. We'll be making these videos of some of the workshops and these talks available online, and so you'll be able to magnify, amplify, which is what Wordfest is doing by bringing Alistair and Nori here from Scotland, by bringing John Lane, Elizabeth Bradfield, Sean Hill, Joy Hardjoe, who is here in town right now, and our wonderful poets from last evening, and all of our workshop presenters. This is what we're doing. We're taking ideas that one person has and we're magnifying them, we're amplifying them to rise above the din of the negative and the din of the violent. And we are working on that together. So when you see one of these videos come across your social media feed, or you come to the Asheville Wordfest website, tell friends, say, hey, watch this. It's not over yet, baby. It is my great, great honor to introduce a wonderful person. Alistair McIntosh asked if he could camp on a little spot of garden at a cottage that I rented in Scotland last summer when I was attending a conference and got the last available rental on the island. And I said, you can actually have a room in the cottage.
What you've not said is that you had to sleep in the woodshed the night before.
Yeah, I learned something. On the first night that Alistair and Nori and Birgit arrived, we were driving back from the airport, and I'd rented them a cottage just 1.2 miles from my house. And I would drive past it to make sure it really existed and that it really was available. And I'd done this practice drive many, many times, but on the night we were getting back from the airport, they were exhausted after the transatlantic and then the Charlotte to Asheville, beautiful fly over the mountains, yes, but I'm tired, and couldn't find the darn house. Circles and circles and circles around Glenarden Elementary, where I drove my daughter to school for 9 months of 5 years. You know, I should have been able to find this thing. And Alistair said, well, what you need to do, it's the ferries. And they know that we've just arrived. And they're messing with us. So what you have to do is take your jacket off and turn it inside out and sit up on it for a little while, and the ferries will go away. And I was like, I'll just turn my GPS. And in light of that, I reframed something that happened when I first went to Scotland. I had rented this cabin, and a gentleman who was renting it to me said, well, I'll leave the keys with the people who run the hotel across the bridge. And it's called the Bridge Across the Atlantic, which you think would be a really, really, really long bridge. And it's about the distance from this end of the room to that end of the room, just really, really tall. And John Lane was there years ago when I sent him posted a photograph. I was there. So we're here in the States, sorry I'm talking so long, but here in the States, when someone says, I'll leave the key at the hotel, you think the hotel's going to be there all night. But in this little island, the hotels close. It's like everyone goes to bed, the owners go to bed, and it's done. So I stayed too late watching the sunset in Oban, and then took a taxi and arrived in the pitch darkness, which exists in such places as this, on the night of the solstice, and didn't have the key to the cottage. And so I walked around in the darkness for a little while, and I lay down on a lawn chair on a property that I thought was my cottage. And I thought, well, I guess I'll just sleep here. And then it started to rain. And so I found the potting shed behind the cottage. And that's where I spent my first night in Scotland, the night of the solstice. And now I realize it was the fairies.
It's called hospitality.
And then the rest of the time was spent listening to people like Norman Bissell and listening to Alistair McIntosh, listening to geologists, rock hounds, artists, writers. Who else was there? Just every single discipline was represented, and everyone was talking about the earth, the one conversation that matters. So on that note, I will hand over the microphone. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, jacket off, inside out, sit a while, and I hope you will enjoy, be moved. I know you will be open, and may this next hour and 15 minutes mean as much to you as it means to me that you're here to hear it. Everyone, welcome Alistair McIntosh.
Thank you so much, Laura, for holding in both practical and spiritual ways this Asheville Wordfest, and for having me and my colleague, the director of the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics, Norman Bissell, is he here just now? There you are, Nori, who has come over with me together with his wife, Birgit. And what I spoke about this morning was land reform in the context of geopoetics, if you like, the social, even political application of the arts to transformation in our world. And I'm now going to take that a level deeper. Now, you must forgive me playing on my phone. Those of you who weren't here this morning, I'm profoundly deaf, and I control my hearing aids together with the help of little microphones, which, when my friend Gareth comes to field the questions, I will ask you to use by holding just a short distance from you.
What's going on?
Uh-oh, I've dropped out. Sorry, we had a wee bit of computer trouble earlier. So, last night in Malaprops, I launched my book, my latest book, Poacher's Pilgrimage. And together with Soil and Soul, those two represent my most major books of the dozen or so that I've written. I only write a book when I really feel something coming up in me. And I never imagined that this one was going to take me 7 years to write, based on a 12-day pilgrimage across my own home island. A poacher's pilgrimage because I had a fishing rod with me. So that when my Presbyterian friends would ask what was I doing, I wouldn't have to kind of raise too many eyebrows by saying I'm on a holy pilgrimage. I could simply say I'm going from loch or lake to lake poaching, which is eminently acceptable given the context of landlordism, which I described to you this morning. But the reason this book took 7 years to write is that, as we have been hearing from Dr. Michael Newton in the previous session, in our tradition, the process of creativity is tied in very much with unconscious processes that were traditionally codified as being about fairy. And so the bards would say, my head was away in the hill. My wife would come back after being out all day, and I might have worked on a single paragraph all day long, and she'd say, you've not had your lunch. And I would say, I'm sorry, I fell down the fairy hill again. Because what happened is that as I worked on this book, deeper and deeper levels of what flows from the land of the island where I was raised, the Isle of Lewis in the north, and it's called Harris, of the Harris Tweed fame, in the south. Deeper and deeper levels. And in particular, I was exploring war, having just come back from teaching on a NATO course to senior diplomats and military, something I've been doing for the past 20 years, lecturing to the military on non-violence. I was exploring God in the sense of where do our theologies, and especially those which I will come to today, sometimes leave us in terms of worldviews that might not be exactly what Christ had intended. And the fairies are the way of understanding the inner life. And so part of what I've written in Poacher's Pilgrimage, I think of as being an ecology of the imagination. And addressing the question, do we merely have imaginations, or do we move in imagination? My theme this evening is Donald Trump, whose mother grew up in a village 8 miles from where I grew up. But I'm not here to go Trump bashing your president. You mean you do? I'm here to try and shed some light of understanding. And I would like to emphasize only from his maternal side, only speculatively, and only in a very narrow slither of part of what might make this complex man tick. And it's not so much Trump himself I am interested in, it is the constituency that voted for him that I'm interested in, and particularly the Scots-Irish connections with that constituency. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about things, but first of all, here is my framing of it. And I realize this is a controversial book. I realize that there are issues about how it has perhaps failed to address race. I have not read the story as such, I've only read the introduction. But by way of framing what I'm wanting to look at, I'd like to read you just some quotes from the introduction. I do not identify, says J.D. Vance, with the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of the Northeast. Instead, I identify with the millions of working-class white Americans of Scots-Irish descent whose ancestors were day labourers in the southern slave economy, etc. Americans call them hillbillies, rednecks, or white trash. I love this next line. I call them neighbours, friends, and family. But we are more socially isolated than ever, and we pass our isolation down to our children. Our religion has changed, built around churches heavy on emotional rhetoric. Our men suffer from a peculiar crisis of masculinity, reacting to bad circumstances in the worst way possible. There is a lack of agency here. The fact that hillbillies like me are more down about the future than many other groups suggests that something else is going on. Now, Donald Trump would probably not consider himself a hillbilly, but what I'm going to talk about might shed some light on some of those statements, albeit statements that are generalizations and possibly caricatures. Nevertheless, you know, this book, Political Book of the Year, Sunday Times, profound, great insight into not just Trump, but also Brexit in the UK, an international bestseller. So something is going on in Vance's take that it's important we understand. So let me cut to the Isle of Lewis here. There's Lewis in the red. There's the position. Harris just to the south here. I was talking this morning about the Isle of Egg. That's that one down there. And the island of Lewis and Harris is a traditional crofting community of small-scale agriculturalists, fishers, living from the sea, living from the land traditionally. Nowadays it's mainly service industry, weaving the famous Harris tweeds. That's my late friend John McGregor at his loom there. That's how we live. And that is my father, just after 1960, when we moved to the island. We've got nearly a century of island connections. My great uncle founded the surgical services on the island, and some very, very remote blood relatives. But basically, we moved in 1960 in order to be of service, my father, as doctor in the community. He had married my English mother when he had a job in the Doncaster Royal Infirmary in Yorkshire, and that was where I was born. And I was 4 years old in 1960 when we moved to Lewis, where I went to school and developed my primary cultural anchorage points. So you grew up in a community. That's me with my sister on the right. You grew up with people, real people in a real place, who are more than just Facebook friends who you like or unlike. There's that boy on the left there. There he is now. And he'll kill me for saying so, but my friend Rusty, there he is again on the left there, the village blacksmith, is one of many people in our part of the world who is distantly related to your president. And who, for the most part, don't talk about your president because his values are an embarrassment to the island. And the Free Church has spoken out on that and said quite clearly that such is the case. I'm going to come more to that. You grow up with these strong connections. When I speak just now, I'm mindful, I'm asking myself, what will Karachi and what will Rusty be thinking if they see this? I am speaking to you in a basket that is held within the community and trying to balance what I say so that it comes over in a way that is appropriate to all of that. And you grow up in such communities in a healthy relationship between generations. So we were largely raised not just by our fathers, but by a wider network for us boys of men and women, but especially going out in the boats or going to the hill for the hunting or whatever. We were raised by the older men. That was Torquil McCrae, the Bard of Grimshatter, with me there, dead now. And that's Shawnee Macaulay, one of the greatest living tradition bearers of the Isle of Harris, who's taken me out and far out into the moors to see a place, a special place, where his father used to go to. That's the kind of context that a real community raises you in. And you see, even if, like me, you do not have blood links worth talking about in such a community, in Celtic communities, and I use that word to mean a linguistic, but also, in my opinion, a cultural, spiritual thing, down the west coast of Scotland into Ireland, down that part of the northeast Atlantic coast, which is a controversial usage. But as I would use that word, in such communities, fostership counts for stronger than blood lineage. It does so because if you are fostered, if you're adopted, you are chosen and you choose. Whereas blood lineage or lineage, kind of, that just comes as part of your embodiment, if you like. But we're talking here about arguably a deeper holding of community, by which a healthy community can adopt people into it so that they come to belong. As chapter 47, I think it is, of the book of Ezekiel puts it, you shall take the children of the alien and allot to them a portion of land, the same as the Israelites, and you shall treat them as Israelites amongst you. You see, it's all there if we choose to read these texts in that way instead of in racist ways. Now, I spoke this morning about the Highland clearances, and I mentioned how all over the island now, communities are building monuments. So here's Malcolm MacLean, who I would say is himself a tradition bearer and a historian. He's been very important in opening up land consciousness. Worked for the Gaelic Arts Project. And this is another Will MacLean design where you've got the name of those who were resisting land ownership here. They were the land raiders in this area called Uig. And you go through a passageway under an archway made of stones cut to be used as the Callanee standing stones, but the raft sunk. Although, Clyde, you've got such an interesting view that they wouldn't have had them on top of the raft, they would have had them slung underneath. And when I put it to one of our experts in stonework, your theory, he just said, ah, as a diver, I understand. That's a technical point we won't go into, but these stones, a number of them were found in the seabed. They've been used here, and the passageway leads through into a circular area with seating for the local teenagers and a brazier so that they can get away from folk and light a fire and come and have their parties up here. So it celebrates the reconstitution of community. So what I'm saying to you is that in a healthy rural society, such as I would say I grew up in, you have very strong anchor points. But we gradually became aware that our history had deprived so many people from that. And so many people lost intergenerationally those kind of connections that we have had because of the way the land was taken from the people and the people dispatched overseas or to the cities. When we think of many Americans of such background, whether from Scotland or other parts of Europe, and I should say white European Americans when I say many Americans there. Notice how I slipped into that, by the way. Do you notice? Us white folks, we just slip into these things so naturally without realizing it. And then I have to come back and qualify myself and so on. It's so hard to stay aware of these things because we get caught up in our culture. But when I think of many white European Americans, and these images, this painting here, the last of the clan, the dejectedness as the last of the clan members are waiting on the pier side to be deported to the new world. Or this other painting, Loch Aber no more, there they are with their few belongings, lamenting, being ripped away from their place. What does that do to the soul? Given what we understand of depth psychology now, how does that knock on from generation to generation? These are questions that Native American folk, First Nation folk, black folks have long asked themselves. I'm suggesting it's high time more of us white folks started asking themselves. A woman who is not white said to me a little while ago that she appreciated or was struck by the fact I'd quoted Audre Lorde, a black American feminist writer, this morning. I said, yes, because from the likes of her and Alice Walker, I have learned so much. We need to be understanding that, not just for the justice of understanding the other cultures we move amongst, if we are white, but also to heal ourselves. And in my experience, that healing is offered generously. I want to go more deeply into how profound this sense of community is. And as I said this morning, I woke up to it when I worked for 4 years in Papua New Guinea. Then I realized we had it naturally back home. And what I've got here, the number of pictures taken by the great American photographer Paul Strand in 1954, the year before I was born. In other words, these are people of the islands who, some of them are still alive. We're not talking ancient history. And I've matched it with quotations gathered by one of my students when I was teaching in the university, Ian McKinnon from Slate on Skye, who in his human ecology thesis in 2007 went and spoke with the elders about what was being lost. And so it's not the people in the picture saying this. I'm using the people in Paul Strand's images to represent the kind of people who are saying these things. Some of these people perhaps still alive. I think most of them have died since 2007. You absorb a lot from your landscape and an awful lot from the people you live with. You might not be aware of it at the time, you might even scorn it, but you are absorbed by it. People were so interdependent. I just accepted that. If I'm blocking anybody's view sitting here, there's chairs here, please feel free to move. We lived for one another. We worked for one another. And we cared for one another. I've given lectures like this and people have said, I can't relate to this. I've never experienced this. And suggested maybe I was exaggerating. But I grew up in this. What you are is your community. So why the obsession was making America great? And I don't just mean in Donald John, one of the most common island names, Trump. I mean more the people who voted for him. Why the obsession with the Bible in one hand, an assault rifle in the other, and a picket fence around the property? Observe that 81% of the white evangelical born-again vote, representing 25% of the American electorate, not only voted for him, but remain pretty loyal towards him. And so, as one of our newspapers had it the other day, to know Donald Trump's faith is to understand his politics. I say to a lot of young students these days, if you really want to study something interesting, consider theology. Consider the tools that people like my late friend, the great American theologian Walter Wink, has provided us with in his trilogy of books, Naming the Powers, Unmasking the Powers, Engaging the Powers. I recommend, in fact, his wife June told me, he too recommended, starting with the last, Engaging the Powers. It is about spiritual activism. Walter's been a huge influence on my work. And this understanding of doing theology, as Gustavo Gutierrez of Brazil would put it, where you contextualize these gospel stories in the modern world so that the Roman soldiers are armed with guns. Donald Trump would say that he got his faith from his mother and claim that this was the Bible that she had given him. So he's not claiming that it came from Frederick Christ Trump on the German side. He's claiming that this religion, with our weekly prayer meetings in the White House, came from his mother's side. And a beautiful young woman she was. Mary Ann MacLeod, baptized into the Presbyterian, the Calvinist Free Church of Scotland. Same as my great-great-grandfather, who I spoke to you about earlier, played a significant role in as a precentor or leader of the praise. And in 1930, May 1930, she sailed on the steamship Transylvania to New York, arriving one day after her 18th birthday. Why would a young lassie, what we would call a bonny young lassie, do such a thing? I ask you to consider the world she was raised in. Before she landed in America, reputedly with $50 in her pocket, and started work as a domestic servant, as an economic migrant. Here is a war memorial in Back, which is the area in which her village of Tang is. Look at the dozens of names on each of these slabs. There's the one for Back. Mary Ann MacLeod was born in 1912. The losses suffered in the Great War of 1419 stand at 1,300, which accounts for about 8% of the total population of the Isle of Lewis, 1 man out of every 6. And then, on New Year's Day 1919, a ship, the Islair, bringing back naval ratings, hit rocks outside Stornoway, and over 200 more drowned. 1 man out of every 5 that Mary Ann Trump was growing up with, who would have been the generation she would have married into had she stayed. 1 in 5 died. And then there was the tuberculosis that had come back with the war, that disproportionately affected the young people. And then the emigration. Mary Ann MacLeod could well have been on the pier here, waving off 260 island youth. In 1923, 4/5 of the passenger manifest showing that they were young men. In that year, 1,000 left the island. Because consider, half of the island is colonized by the landowners. The people have been pushed onto the other half. It wasn't just overpopulation. It was also land privation. Imagine growing up with that hemorrhage of those you might want to fall in love with. And so she arrives in America. There's family circumstances I don't need to go into, it's not appropriate. But also, like many of her generation, she arrived in America, where she met Frederick Christ Trump, property developer, and became a wealthy woman, as you see here. But get this, let's take this at a whole deeper cut. I've talked about war and the TB and the emigration. Let's take a deeper cut still, because I've been talking about the clearances. Here's the family tree. There's Donald. There's Mary Ann. And I want you to look at Mary Ann's maternal side, her mother Mary Smith, born 1867, coming from Donald Smith and Mary Macaulay, the Smiths and the Macaulays. My friend Rusty was connected to the Smiths side. And here is a letter to me from the island genealogist Bill Lawson, after I wrote to seek clarification and his opinion. Dear Alistair, I'm afraid that the American media reports on Donald Trump are like too many of their media reports, partly right and partly wrong. Well, you could say the same of the BBC. Mrs. Trump's paternal side, mainly MacLeods, were from Tongue and Wataska areas and merely moved around crofts in the area in the usual way, with marriage, etc. It was on her mother's side that we come upon the clearances, the Highland clearances, with the Smiths from Burnish and South Lochs and the Macaulays from Kirkabost and Bernera, both cleared in the 1820s, specifically 1826 in the case of Burnish. I hope this clarifies matters for you. Best wishes, Bill Lawson. So here's my late friend Angus Ease MacLeod, a major tradition bearer, who mapped all the villages. There's about 36 villages in this small area of Lewis, from which the Smiths were evicted in 1826, evicted at the same time. An area I know very well because I used to be a gilly and pony boy with the salmon fishing and the hunting. There's Burnish there. Different spellings. Let's take a look at the first map made of the island. Survey date 1852 to 3, published in 1855. There you have Burnish in the Gaelic spelling here. And you won't be able to see from where you're sitting, but you might be able to make out these rectangular structures. There's lots of them. Ruin, 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 ruins, ruin, ruins, ruin. That's Burnish, from which the Smith side of Trump's maternal ancestors were cleared. Mary Ann Trump's grandparents, or more likely great-grandparents, I'm not exactly sure which. Let me show you it from Google Earth. You can go in on Google Earth and check it out yourselves. Ruin, ruins, ruin, ruins, ruin. Can you see them? You can see them best here. I know this area so well because you notice the Stoker's Pass. We would land here by boat. We'd get the horse or the Argo cat and go up into the moors with the shooters for the deer. My job would be to bring it back when I was in my late teens, early 20s. Notice also these lines upon the land. Those are the Fiannagan, the raised beds of their agriculture, made by hand on impoverished soil by bringing seaweed and sand up from the shore and building up, very raised so that they would drain with a heavy rainfall. Imagine being this village, and in 1826 the landowner saying, get out, I want to rent it for a sheep farm. What does that do to you? What does that do to your capacity to feel emotion, to share emotion, to show emotion? Might you perhaps bottle it up? And when it is well and truly bottled up, might you turn to the bottle or whatever? And Burnish, this is the grazings area of Burnish. Here I went back to my old job for a week to re-experience it. The village is down out of sight there. At the time I didn't know its significance was Trump, otherwise I would have taken photographs of the ruins. So who did this? In the early 17th century, the emergent British, Scottish, British state, which had the Union of the Crowns, gave the Clan Mackenzie a commission of fire and sword, which basically meant you could burn people out and you could kill people, to colonize the Isle of Lewis for their own benefits. Here is Colonel Humberston Mackenzie, Colonel Francis Humberston Mackenzie. And basically the deal was if you raise the Seaforth Highlanders, try and do it by volunteers, and when that fails, go in and press gang people, go into the village and hold the women at bayonet point at their breasts, as you take away all the young men, only one of whom ever returned in the village I'm thinking of. Or call them into a sermon in the church in the village of Cuse, Townsea Island. And when they're inside for the sermon, shut the doors, and then the redcoats come and drag them into the press gang ship. Raised the Seaforth Highlanders, and was rewarded for that by being made Governor-General of the Barbados slave colony before the ending of slavery. So his daughter, Elizabeth Frederica, subsequently Stuart Mackenzie, was raised partly in the Barbados. She then married Admiral Sir Samuel Hood, who commanded the British fleet from Madras. He was much older than her. He died, and she came back, her three brothers having predeceased her, so she inherited the whole of the Isle of Lewis in 1815. Now, the Mackenzies were one of those, it's misleading to say one of those clans, because it wasn't the clan people. It was the leadership that had been deliberately anglicised by measures starting with the 1609 Statutes of Iona that required that the indigenous leadership had to be educated in the English language, which meant going away from their homes to private schools where they got brought up in a way that cut them off from their indigenous roots. Exactly the same thing I saw in Papua New Guinea, where the corporation would say to the village headman, well, I'll educate your children in Australia, and that all helps the mine or whatever it is to go ahead. Exactly the same dynamic. So the Mackenzie leadership were heavily into what they euphemistically called the Africa trade. They had plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas. This is only now emerging. This is only historical work here, 2011, unpacking it. And, Mackenzie advertised for sale in 1803 as part of a cargo of prime Gold Coast Negroes, slaves who he or his people had named Britain, Brahan, Kintail, Dingwall, Gordon, Inverness, Sutherland, Ross, and Lewis. He named them after the places over which he had feudal control. Now, I want to touch on something that relates to Michael's lecture just now on the fairies. Because here's a rather cheap camera picture from, let's see, my sister then would be about 16, born in 1956, so early 60s. There's Peggy MacLeod, who was a surgery cleaner. There's my father, my mother, Isabel, the dog Opal. And I'd like to draw attention to this woman here, Agnes McLennan of 4A Arkmore, telephone number crosspost 272. Everybody knows because she's my father's practice manager. And if anything went wrong and the doctor wasn't there, you called Agnes. Agnes is still alive. I was on the phone to her just 3-4 weeks ago. She was telling me yet more stories. And let me just see where I'm going here. Yeah. And I want to talk about, and I'm pivoting it partly on this book, The Secret Commonwealths of Elves, Fauns and Fairies by the Reverend Robert Kirk of Aberfoyle, written round about 1691. An important ethnographic text, foundational ethnographic text of indigenous fairy belief. And the bit that I want to get at is not so much the fairies here, that's all part of it, this sense of a supernatural otherworld, but particularly the second sight. And I want to get to the second sight, particularly in relation to President Trump. And I'm going to read you a passage from Porcher's Pilgrimage. There's a few copies up there, but I'm afraid in America they're quite expensive. They're $59. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's just the way, the only publisher I could find in America does print on demand, and it's wonderful that Cascade have brought this out, and it really helps me in terms of it being a theological publishing house. But it does make it harder to reach than others of my books. The Gaelic term usually translated as a supernatural is anagraicha. Where is he? Before he corrects me. My friend, the American scholar Michael Newton, who takes a special interest in Gaelic metaphysics, tells me that it is pronounced like anagraicha, except with sounds that scarcely exist in English. By the way, you'll notice that I am partly a product of the problem I am talking about, in that I was raised to look down on Gaelic and not learn it at the time when I could have done. I'm now so deaf I can't hear the sound, but I'm deeply into the culture that's behind these words. This word means the unusual, the uncanny, but these in a sense that is not completely of another world. In other words, an interaction between this world and the other world. Rarely do I come home to the island without receiving first-hand accounts of the second sight. If I seem to be unusually open to such a contested reality, especially as I have a BSc in science and an MBA in finance, if I seem to be unusually open given such a rationalistic background, it's partly because I've experienced a dramatic case myself. When I was 18, I had the experience of watching helplessly as my father's beloved whippet crossed the road and was killed outright. My mother had left for Stornoway 7 miles away just 10 minutes previously. She went there nearly every day, but on this occasion, she was just on the outskirts of the town when she was hit by an overwhelming compulsion to turn back. As I set about digging the dog's grave in the practical way one does in a rural society, I saw her car speeding down the hill. She skidded to a halt in the gravel of the driveway, jumped out, and looking racked with dread, demanded to know what was wrong. My answer was a relief. She said, "I thought it might have been a child." In the island's tradition, such experiences usually surround emotionally charged events like marriages, deaths, and collective calamities. For example, in 2002, a retired policeman and lobster fisherman in Harris, Norman MacLeod of Bridge House, wrote me a letter, it was 5 pages long, after reading a book called All in the Mind, Farewell to God by Ludovic Kennedy. The broadcaster had pooh-hooed the idea of prophecy, to which Norman responded, "Even if I had never heard of the Bible or of God, anyone as afflicted or gifted with a second sight as I am, to put it mildly, could not accept that." To give one tiny example, I could have written an account of the Falklands War and every stage of it, weeks or days before it happened, including being transported the 8,000 miles there in a split second and seeing things that were to appear on TV afterwards, such as the warship HMS Sheffield with the metal superstructure going up in white incandescent flames. It actually happened. I could go on at great length, but as you are unlikely to believe a word of it, I will leave it at that. My God, Alistair, is a high and lofty one, who inhabiteth eternity, whose name is holy, not subject to any laws of man, mathematics, time or motion, and certainly not to be catalogued within the tiny mind of Ludovic Kennedy or any other mere mortal. Now, Dad's practice manager, Agnes McLennan of Achmore, told me of an old man amongst her people on Great Bernera who could locate the bodies of drowned fishermen because he heard the scream as they fell overboard. "Make sure you keep thinking about the stories I'm telling you," she said at the end of one of my visits. I wrote her words of advice down in my notebook. They signified an importance that ran deeper than just superficial curiosity. Another time I asked her, Do you think that people experience a second sight these days as much as they used to? No, she harumphed, because these days everybody is too busy and too noisy. In his record of the fairy faith amongst his 17th century parishioners in Highland Perthshire, the Reverend Robert Kirk quotes at length from correspondence between his contemporaries, Lord Talbot and Sir Robert Boyle. The former was a Highland judge of the Mackenzie landowning dynasty, the latter was a physicist who gave us Boyle's law about the expansion of gases. Talbot told Boyle of an observation made by a gentleman of his acquaintance who had gone to the Barbados. Quote, several of those that did see with the second sight, when in the Highlands or Isles, when transported to live in other countries, especially in America, they quite lost this quality. Talbot noted, there were more of these seers in the Isles of Lewis, Harris and Uist than in any other place. Margaret Bennett is another of the School of Scottish Studies folklorists. She has observed that stories of the second sight have remained strong. To this day, wherever community and tradition remain strong in Hebridean diaspora outposts, including pockets in Newfoundland, Quebec, North Carolina, and New South Wales. Why then might it have been lost so quickly to those of Talbot's near acquaintance? Talbot took a business interest in the Africa trade, which is to say, slavery. Barbados was a slave colony in his time, the Deep South, that would one day become the stronghold of the KKK and the Bible Belt, much the same. Could it be that violence to one's fellow humankind inflicts internal injuries upon oneself? That it violates a deeper psychic cohesion, the very basis of our interconnection through mind's immanence, as Gregory Bateson put it, in the larger system. And that the effects of war, its moral hazard, can therefore linger on long after the outward guns have fallen silent. What are we carrying? So, it was the landlady I've just shown you, Lady Mary, who introduced and handpicked the hardline clergy, starting with the Reverend Alexander MacLeod, who said that when the people were showed that their fears and terrors unspeakable, would never terminate through rounds and rounds of eternal ages, if the offers of salvation were rejected, you would think that every heart was pierced, and general distress spread through the whole congregation. May it bear forth fruit. So what's going on here? What's going on here is a hard-line version of Calvinism, the 5-point tulip, that the human condition is totally depraved, that some are unconditionally elect, that Christ's death was limited in its benefits, as this would see it, only for the elect. Grace is irresistible, and once you're one of the elect, no matter what you do, you always are. But the critical thing here is that this worldview sets up a binary division between the damned and the elect. And so historians have traced us to the idea of British and American exceptionalism and of manifest destiny. John O'Sullivan here, it is our manifest destiny. Here you have the spirit of manifest destiny, or spirit of progress, in this painting, American Progress by John Gast. It is our manifest destiny to overspread and possess the whole of the continent, which providence, divine providence, has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty. And there you have the spirit of manifest destiny and here comes the railroad, the wagons and so on, and there's the Native Americans and the bisons being driven away. Ironically, with many of the soldiers having been cleared from the highlands. And this playing through in the teaching of people of Scots Protestant origin, like Billy Graham. And then George Bush, the Reverend Graham, planted a mustard seed in my soul. I feel like God wants me to run for president. I can't explain it, but I sense my country is going to need me. Something is going to happen, and at that time, my country is going to need me. Year 2000 political memo. So you see how the psychology shapes expectation and gives a mandate. And so you get a binary division, an axis of evil, good state, bad state, because we're carrying this in our psyches and we haven't unpacked it. And so Donald tells us, I will build a wall and Mexico will pay. But I am suggesting to you that perhaps with his faith coming from his mother, no longer held in the caring basket of communities, such as it is back home on the Isle of Lewis, I suggest to you that that wall runs through Donald Trump's mind and the minds of many of that evangelical constituency that voted for him. And so our men suffer from a peculiar crisis of masculinity, reacting to bad circumstances in the worst way possible. There is a lack of agency here. A lack of agency. We have no free will, you see, in this schema. We are either damned or elect. As Patti Smith put it, Jesus died for someone's sins, but not for mine. The fact that hillbillies like me are more down about the future than many other groups suggests that something else is going on. And so when Donald Trump came back in 2009 to visit his relatives, people I've grown up amongst, he spent exactly 90 seconds in the family home just to get the photo shot. When he was elected president, here is the headline of the local newspaper. The main story is a non-story. A small story is that a man sprung from the loins of a woman from Lewis has taken official control of the most powerful political office in the world. I leave you with the question, where now, not just with Donald John Trump, but with all who might be of this binary mindset? How do we relate to that? Because if we simply attack them, we're playing on home turf. Jesus said, love your enemies. Do good to them who harm you. I leave it with you that we have to approach this in the sense of how do we call home our prodigal children. And I want to end with reading from the poem that I wrote long before John Trump was standing for president, but when he was messing up our people, trying to evict people or force people out with a golf course in Scotland. And I'll just read you this page and a half here. The end of a long poem. Oh, Donald Trump, be not mistaken. The island does not cast a curse, does not return the shameful act with evil eye, sufficient that it just withdraws its blessing. 'Tis you who stand yourself accursed and drains the flow of life, the artery cut that curls and tightens dreadful back upon itself. The island stands not for a curse, but only to forgive, to draw back in its prodigals. Not 7 times, they say, but 70 times 7 times. You told the world you loved this land and wished your mother's memory through naming your development. We have perforce observed, not after Mary Ann MacLeod, but after Mr. Trump. Don't make for her a bunker from the plunder of another woman's world, from beauty's desecration of true nature, free and wild, from climate change, vainglorious in guiltless decadence. Come home, Donald. Come home in your mind. Come home to gentle, honest folks. Come home to nature's guileless way, without greed, without force, without tears. Renounce the rootless sands of capital and pride. Renounce the decorated corpse of suppurating wealth. Renounce those vicious, violent, so-called winning ways. Come home, oh Donald Trump! Come home to this new start and build a golden tower to be your greatest work of living art that rises from the fairway as the meteoric human heart, transmuted, transfigured, transubstantiated. Come home, Donald. Just come on home. Have we any time for questions? Or are we out of time?
We're at 5 o'clock, and at 5:30 Amelia Phillips will be reading, but we can talk until she arrives, and I think that would be wonderful. Also tomorrow morning at 9, come back, and Nori and Alistair.